So hi there, it's Gertie Golden here, and I'm going to be taking you through some web development series. And before we get started, we are going to start off by understanding what web development is. Now, when it comes to web development, it's mainly a process that we use in terms of creating and maintaining websites or even web applications that mainly run on the internet or on the intranet. So in simple terms, when it comes to web development, it's how different websites like maybe Google or Facebook, or maybe even the company websites that you do have, or maybe portfolio websites are built and how they are made to function. And when it comes to web development, it has three main parts in that the common one is what you call as the front-end development. Now, when it comes to front-end development, we mainly focus on the design and the interface of the website or the web system. In terms of a front-end development, this is where, for example, you're going to go ahead and maybe focus on the layout and the colors of the site or the web system that you're trying to work on. Or maybe on the other hand, you could focus on the different maybe kind of different multimedia elements that you're trying to embed, depending on whatever you're building. Or they could be buttons like call to action buttons. You could be maybe you could be focusing on maybe trying to add forms or animations, etc., or even focusing on the responsive design of the site. So front-end development, this is where you're always going to focus into building what the end users are always going to see, something like this. So when it comes to front-end development, that is where you're going to hear terminologies like a front-end developer and also technologies that are commonly used in terms of front-end development. You're going to hear about things like HTML, CSS, or JavaScript commonly for interactivity. So front-end development is where you're going to see the beauty or the elements that you're really going to work with in terms of the graphical user interface. For example, when someone maybe goes ahead and clicks, for example, if I could go ahead and maybe click on this kind of button, you notice that it redirects to a different page. So the process that we undertake to come up with all these designs and building up of all these web pages is what we call as front-end development. Then on the other hand, for cases whereby we are working with back-end, the back-end development, that is where we handle what we call as the server-side logic. Now for the server-side logic, we could maybe work with databases in that, for example, if we do have an e-commerce kind of system, for example, if we do have this kind of system, let me try to open up the site. Let me see. Okay, so for example, if we have this kind of website, you notice that it is an e-commerce store. So most of the times, what we can do, we always ensure that all this data is coming from the backend. It means that we are going to have some kind of database that is going to store all the products, all the brands, all the categories, whatever the site is going to use, or if it is a web system, whatever data that is going to be used, it is always going to be stored in a database to ensure that the data is persisted. Then for cases whereby we are trying to log in the users, of course, all that kind of logic is going to be handled in the backend. And if maybe on the other hand, we are trying to work with an API, then maybe we believe that you could be having something like a mobile application that is communicating via the API and maybe getting data from the database. And also if we have something like maybe someone like a system administrator that are trying to work with the web system, maybe to manage the data that the mobile application has. So for the backend development, that is where you're going to at least have to learn the knowledge of working with database management systems, like maybe this one. It could be working with relational database management systems, like maybe MySQL, or you could work with no SQL systems, like maybe MongoDB, depending on what you're exactly building. So backend development is always going to focus on the business logic. And for that case, we could work with technologies maybe like PHP, Python, Node JavaScript, and then Laravel. So most of the times for both our front-end development and back-end development, you're going to notice that there are always what we call as frameworks. A framework could be like an improved version of the language, in that instead of you working with maybe, for example, building a website from scratch using maybe HTML, you could work with other frameworks or libraries that already have packages, for example, for authentication, and everything is already scaffolded in one place. So instead of you manually building maybe the navigation bar or any kind of maybe feature embedded in a framework, you notice that it could already be inbuilt. So personally, me, I always work with Laravel, and most of the times, instead of me again going ahead and building the authentication process, like for example, the login form and the logic of registering and logging in a user. If you're working with frameworks, you notice that they're going to come pre-built in, that the authentication process is already there for you. And all you have to do is maybe to focus on these other core features of the system. So the ability for me, for example, to go ahead and provide my details and maybe log into the system is because of the back-end integration. And this is where the data is always going to be stored via the database and maybe queried or retrieved into these other systems, like whatever you're going to see. Then on the other hand, in terms of web development, still we always have what we call as the full stack development. So full stack development, just like the way something is going to be like fully packaged, with full stack development, this is when someone does both the front end and the back end development. Like you have the ability of not only building what the user is going to see, but on the other hand, you also have the ability of integrating the logic, that if maybe you have a system and you notice that it's going to use authentication, you're going to also go ahead and ensure that maybe when someone logs in, they have the ability of logging in. Or maybe if we want to make a sale, do you really have the ability of making a sale, right, via the system? And are the records of the new sale being stored in the database? All that kind of information is going to come into the back end, and also ability for you to work with the front end. So the moment you realize that you can really work with the integration logic as well, like the logic for the system being integrated into the front end, then you can count yourself as a front end developer. Most of the times, if maybe you're not making use of this kind of approach, then on the other hand, you could maybe be working with what we call as APIs. So depending on what you are exactly working on, you could work with an API in that you have the ability of building the API and you go ahead and document it. Commonly, for example, for my case, I really work with Swagger, for example, this kind of documentation. So you notice that for this case, you're going to have something like a website, in that the website is going to retrieve its information from the backend, and the communication is going to be via that API. So full stack development is not hard for sure, but most of the times you always have to focus on one language. If, for example, you go ahead and tell us that I'm trying to learn Python, and at the same time you're also learning JavaScript, at some point of time you could get confused. So when you focus on one language and try to maybe advance with time, after some time you'll be able to handle both front-end development and back-end development. Personally, I started with front-end development and I found it easy. But then when it switched to back-end development, it was quite challenging, because it's where you have to do a lot of problem solving, the logic and all that. But with time, I personally now feel like back-end development is even easier than front-end development, because front-end development has pretty much for you to change here and there, change the designs, change the color themes, and but That's front-end development. But for back-end development, you're going to, for example, if it is authentication, it's not going to change. If maybe users are supposed to log in using maybe their email address and a password, that is going to be the flow. If they have switched to maybe two-factor authentication, it's also not going to change that much. But front-end development has a lot of tasks. Clients are going to have changing requirements, now change these colors, now these images, and so most of the times you would find yourself that maybe you have something like a content management system in that you not only have the website displaying the data, but on the other hand, maybe the website is actually retrieving its data from the backend. You could go ahead and build a customized system like this one I did show you, give insights on. Or maybe on the other hand, you could work with advanced systems like maybe you could maybe go ahead and work with content management systems like WordPress, depending on what exactly you want to build. Yeah, but if you know both of them anyway, it becomes easier to handle front end and back end. Like if you're doing front end most of the times, at least you must have some insights on how the back end is structured, so that at least you'll be able to also build the front end, maybe models or components to be compatible with the back end. So yeah, pretty much with web development, but for these sessions, I'll be focusing on web designing. And maybe with time, I'll share insights on how to work with backend development. But most of the times, I really work with PHP Laravel. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. So when it comes to web development, there are going to be a number of what we call as websites. Like I've already shared with you some of these. These are all websites. Apart from this other one, it is a system, but for example, this is a website for an NGO, and on the other hand, this is also a website for an e-commerce store. Then on the other hand, this is also a website for a school. So you could ask oneself, what is a website? Now, when we are working with web development, there are going to be a number of terminologies for you to take note of. And most of the times when you're new here to this kind of world, you can always have a notebook that is keeping track of all the new terminologies that you're going to be learning or along this journey. So a website itself, it's going to be a collection of web pages that are linked together and accessible via the internet using a web browser. Jesus, I think I did that. Yes, so when it comes to a website, it's going to be a collection of web pages that are linked together and accessible via the internet using a web browser. So a web browser is also a new terminology. Now, when it comes to a website, actually tech is not that hard. You always have to just understand, like try to understand the terminologies first. So when it comes to a website itself, I want you to always look at a website like a notebook. So if we have a notebook, I'm just going to try to draw something chap here. So if this is a notebook, we have all seen that whenever you have a notebook or any kind of book, it's going to have pages or paper. So every page is always going to have different content. So when it comes to a website, we are always going to have what we call as web pages. For example, this could be the first page, and inside you could also have a different page. So we are always going to see a website in that all these pages are going to be stored in one place in the whole notebook. So if it is going to be a book, it's going to have a number of pages to combined all together, depending on the design of the book. So in the same way, if we have a website, the website is going to have different pages. For example, if I navigate back to the home page, notice that this is what we call as the home page or the landing page, like the first page that we always see when you try to access a website is the home page. However, on the other hand, if maybe I go to programs, you notice that this is also a different page. Same applies if I went to any other page. So there are also going to be cases whereby, for example, when I go to admissions, you notice that it has a navigation bar, like these menu items are still kept in place because there is a concept of what you call as consistency. But most of the main content is always going to be very, very different. If I want to contact us, you notice that it is also different. So just like the way you could go and buy a notebook, you should always see the book as a website, but the difference is that these pages are always going to be into what we call as web pages. So that also brings us into what the word web is. Now, most of the times, I think a number of you have already heard the word web. Nowadays, it's also known as the World Wide Web. So when it comes to the word web, this is something that is connected together, like, think like a net or maybe a spider web. So the word web, if I try to check it out so that we can get some images on it. So if you've seen something like a spider web, you've seen that it's always going to have a number of connections, something like this. But practically, when it comes to technology, this is going to like show a number of different threads that are connected together. But in terms of technology, this is going to be a huge network of connected computers and websites around the world. So if you went ahead and searched for www or the World Wide Web, something like this, it is always going to be a wide connection of different systems of information on the internet. So for example, if we have one website that links to another, I think this one doesn't have, but let's assume that maybe we are trying to work with some other site and you notice that it's redirecting to maybe an external site. So when it comes to the web, the main point here is that the web pages are always going to connect to each other. Like if maybe I click on impact, notice that we redirect to the impact page. Then on the other hand, of course, if it's going to be in terms of networking, we're always going to have computers communicating maybe with other different networking devices, or we're also going to have maybe computers communicating with what we call as a server. So everything is always going to be interconnected together. So if we have a website, it must be a collection of different web pages, but these web pages must be linked together. They're what we call as the hyperlinks if we are using HTML, and they must always be accessed via the internet and mainly using a web browser. Though most of the times when we are still developing the site, you shall be into what we call as local development, and you'll notice that you'll have the ability of building the website even without internet. But at the point of deployment or hosting, you notice that for you maybe to go ahead and search for this kind of site or maybe this kind of school site, I really have to go ahead and type, for example, the name of the school. Then if maybe we do have the search engine optimization already set up, okay, my bad, this didn't, okay. For example, if I search for it, you notice that it's going to appear among the search results. So among the search results, that is when now I'm going to go ahead and access the site itself. So web development in summary is going to focus on building things. Of course, now when I say things, it comes off like I'm not using the tech words, but most of the times we're going to focus on building websites like this. It can also be maybe a company site or a portfolio site or even a blog or even an entertainment website. If I went to YouTube and maybe tried to search for something, or if maybe wanted to go ahead and order. So depending on whatever you want. So for this series, I'll keep the scope a little precise in that we focus on learning how to build websites, and yeah, you can always advance and be able maybe to go ahead and build such systems from scratch. So at this point of time, you can see that I'm really making use of a web browser, Google Chrome, to view the contents of, for example, this kind of system or this other website. So for you to be able to view any contents of a website or a web system or any kind of web application, you're always going to use a web browser regardless of the type. So right now I'm making use of Google Chrome. So if I went ahead and search for Chrome, this is the logo. However, on the other hand, you could maybe be making use of Microsoft Edge. That is if you're using Windows by default. That is the browser that is going to be embedded for you, this one right here. Then on the other hand, there is also Mozilla Firefox. Like there are a number of them for sure. Then if maybe you're not making use of Windows operating system and maybe you have a MacBook, you have at least seen Safari. Yeah, so if maybe you're making use of Safari, that is if you're using maybe a MacBook. So the web browser in this context is always going to be an application software that is always going to be installed on your machine. So for example, by default, you wouldn't be having Google Chrome. That means that for you to work with Google Chrome, you must go ahead and search for it, and then maybe you install it based on your operating system. So for example, Google Chrome Windows, then maybe you also add the download. So such softwares require you to first go ahead and download them, then you install them. So if you're really interested in viewing the details of a web page, you must always open its contents in a web browser. So you notice that this is my account, and this is the way I'm trying to actually go ahead and look at the details of all these websites. And same applies if you're maybe building a website from scratch. You're going to notice that you're always supposed to go ahead and maybe open it up, not even maybe, but open its contents using your favorite web browser. So the software that we use to view the contents is what you call as a web browser. So for all those sites you have seen, you did notice that, or if you haven't noticed, it is important for you to also take note of the fact that every website or web system is always going to be identified using what you call as a domain name. So now a domain name in this context is going to be a unique name that has been assigned to a particular web application. So for example, at this point of time, this is a school site and its domain name is empathy. Okay, we can now see the domain name right here. So the unique identifier for the website is what you call as the domain name. And if I went ahead and maybe checked out when it comes to this other one, you notice that this is the e-commerce. Okay, now my bad. Let me try to make use of the exact domain name for this other site. So the domain name for this other site is right here. However, I notice that for it, it has .com. If maybe I try to access any other, this other one is also an NGO. So the domain name is always going to be the unique identifier for the website. Or if it is not a website, it could also be a web system. And notice that this other one has this kind of domain name for demo purposes. So whenever I want to maybe try to look at or browse that data on the internet, when it comes to websites or web systems, you're supposed to at least know about the name of the site. So most of the times, if it has been fully linked up with search engine optimization, that is when you're going to go ahead and search for it, and then its contents are going to be viewed. So those days back, you could always maybe try to search for a site using what you call as the IP address. An IP address is always going to be a unique identifier for any device that is connected to the network. So what happens is that we always have what you call as a domain name system. A domain name system means that it's going to act like the phone book of the internet. That is always going to help us to translate the human readable domain names into their IP addresses. So IP addresses, depending on the version, you could be having IP version 4 or maybe IP version 6. But for example, if I give you insights on the one of IP version 4, let me try to see right here. Oh, my bad. So for example, if we are making use, okay. So for example, if we are making use of the IP address alongside the domain. So those days back, you could access a website and the URL could be, for example, 192.47 and maybe 0.21 and maybe 0.1. However, I noticed that it becomes very difficult for you to master all these numbers. If it was a different site, then maybe it could also have a particular IP address, maybe 191, maybe 0.13, maybe 0.4, and maybe 0.5, as this stands for IP version 4. So this becomes very, very hard for you to always memorize all these IP addresses. So you just imagine, like, for example, I don't think that you know all the contact numbers of the people you have in your phone, like the digits. It's very, very hard for you to memorize all those numbers. So that is where the DNS or the domain name system comes in play, in that it's going to do a mapping of your domain. For example, what we did see with this kind of website, you notice that this is its domain. So the domain name system is always going to come in play in that instead of you cramming all these words, all you're supposed to do at least is maybe to know the name of the site. Or if you already know even the domain, it becomes even easier. For example, if we assume that this is the IP address for that domain that we did see. So for example, when I try to access empathy, maybe communityhighschool.org, the domain name system goes ahead and translates. It looks for the IP address that points to this domain. So when it gets a match, then it knows that now I'm going to go ahead and maybe send a request to the server for this domain. So it becomes easier for you to always memorize these user-friendly domain names than always cramming and mastering all these digits. Just like the same way, you really don't know maybe your friend's number, but at least you know that maybe it ends with 203, or most commonly, because this is like the standard approach, you're going to save someone's number and you're going to give it a name that you can always quickly memorize. So that is like the domain name when it comes to the world of web development. So every website or web application is going to be hosted on what we call as a web server. Now, a web server can be a computer itself, like hardware, or it can also be maybe a software. It's both hardware and software. But the beauty is that it's always going to enable us to store or host the contents of the website or the web system. So the databases, the files of the site, and everything are always going to be stored onto the web server. So depending on the hosting platform, for sure. So for example, this is one in terms of shared hosting. So with the server itself, just like, let's assume that you have an apartment, or maybe you're owning an apartment. So you notice that, okay, when I say owning, it doesn't come up clear. So for example, let's assume that you did see a nice apartment around your home area and you wanted to start renting in there. So with the shared hosting platform, you're going to maybe go ahead and start renting one room, right? Then on the other hand, you're going to go ahead and maybe shift and enter into that room. So you notice that you're always going to be paying a particular amount of money for rent. So if this is the apartment right here, if this is our apartment right here, we believe that it is going to act like the whole server. So when it comes to shared hosting, you could go ahead and maybe rent a particular space. It's more like you renting a particular room in that apartment. So we believe that maybe the whole apartment has a number of rooms and you could only be interested in maybe room 1 on level 1. Okay, maybe the ground floor. So you're going to go ahead and pay for that space and you're going to start renting that space. So it is the same way how servers work, in that you're going to, if it is shared hosting, you're always going to go ahead and rent a particular room, such that you also have neighbors, but you're all making use of the same apartment. Then on the other hand, if it is not really shared hosting, you could maybe have a virtual private server or maybe a dedicated server. So depending on the type. So someone will tell you, for me, I'm going to buy the whole apartment. And then maybe they start renting out to other people like that. So the server is always going to store all the contents of the site and maybe other tools that the site would need. So if it is going to be a shared hosting platform, for example, this is the cPanel that you could be using to manage the contents of the file. For example, when I check right here, I notice that this is more like what you call as the file manager tool for the cPanel. So for all the files that I did deploy, they're always going to be in here. So depending on what exactly you're trying to deploy, you always need a server. It can be local when you're maybe building locally, or when you switch to production, you will need a production server, a space where you're going to store the files of the system. So today websites are really built with different purposes because client requirements are always changing and most of them are very different. So sometimes you could be building one for maybe a business, maybe like an e-commerce store like we did see. It could also be an education site like the other one. It could be an entertainment like one, like Netflix if you're trying to watch movies. Or it could be a personal site like your personal portfolio or maybe a blog. So websites are always going to be made up of a number of web pages. I already gave insights on that. And all these web pages are going to be linked together. And the website is always going to be accessible via the internet. It could be public, or maybe it could be a private network. And for you to access the websites or even web systems are always going to make use of the domain name, the unique identifier for the site or for the web system. If it is Facebook, for example, you could see something like facebook.com. So these names are always unique. It means that if Facebook went ahead and bought this kind of domain, you're not going to find it with any other company. So it's always going to be only owned by that company that has already taken over it, unless if you're going to buy it from them. So depending on the argument, but when you buy a domain, you're not going to find it with any other person. That is the meaning. So websites today are always going to contain a number of graphics, media, or multimedia elements. They can actually contain text, images, videos, and interactive elements. So when it comes to text, I think everyone has already seen text. For example, this is text right here. If I went into maybe a different one, like maybe an e-commerce store, for example, majority of you really work with, for example, Gigi for Uganda. You can always check it out. Okay, I think Jumia, right? For example, if you're trying to work with an e-commerce store, we try to use Jumia Uganda. So you notice that this is also an e-commerce store, and we are trying to access the contents via a web browser. Now, there is always a confusion between a website and a mobile app. For the website, you're always going to see or view its contents via the web browser. But a mobile application is always going to be installed on the mobile device. So you go maybe to the Google Play Store or to the App Store and you install. But for websites, you're only supposed to know maybe the name and you search it via maybe via the search engine. Or if you already have the link, you go ahead and access it via the link or maybe the domain. So for websites, you're not going to install it, most especially if it is being accessed via the internet. But mobile applications, you have to go to Google Play Store and download like that. So websites are always going to have a number of elements, multimedia elements. Like this can be text, like you can see right here. This is the word services. Then the images. Then you also have what you call as call to action buttons. If maybe I wanted to cut this element, and maybe I try to increase the quantity, then you notice that there is a notification flash message right here. Then I can click on the button and it goes ahead and opens up to a different page. So you notice that the domain right here is jumia.ug. So there are what you call as, I think they're called top level domains, something like that, where you have .ug for Uganda, .com for commercial sites, then .org for organizations like that. So this one, I think it's what you call as a country level domain, in that it only points to Uganda. So a number of different multimedia elements can always be embedded in a website depending on how you are bringing out the styles or the designs. And I've already given you insights when it comes to the different examples of websites. Maybe in addition to the web server, it's going to be a computer system or software that stores and processes and also goes ahead and delivers web pages to users when requested through a web browser. So web servers, I'm going to mainly focus on what you call as the client side architecture. So just like you can see right here, most of the times you're going to maybe use your phone or maybe your computer, and you're trying to maybe access a browser like Google Chrome. So within Google Chrome, like we did see, you can go ahead and maybe search for an online store like Jumia. So this content is going to be displayed via the browser. But behind the scenes, there is some kind of background processing being done. In that one, we have the server computer right here that is storing all the files or the resources that that site needs. Then on the other hand, we also do have you, the user, the end user seated on your machine. So whenever you need content, for example, if you wanted to look at the products that Jumia is having, you're going to send a request. So for example, if you wanted to look at the latest products, you're going to access the section for the latest products. So behind the scenes, how this works is that you send a request via the browser, and of course, this is sent to the server. So the server is going to receive your request and it's always going to process based on the type of request. Now, there are what you call as HTTP methods. In that, maybe if you wanted to look at products, it's going to be what you call as a GET request. If you're maybe trying to make an order, it's going to be a POST request. So depending on what exactly you're trying to do. So if the data exists, you're always going to, for both actually, for all circumstances, if the data exists or not, you're always going to get a response. So if, for example, the products do exist, you're going to get a display of the products right here, like the ones we can see. Then on the other hand, maybe if the products do not exist, or if you're trying to manipulate or try to play around with the URL, let me try to type something. So here we are trying to send a request to the Jumia server and we are getting a response. However, the fact that I did try to manipulate or try to change the URL, you notice that the response we are getting from the server is not found. So that kind of background processing of the request response cycle is always going to be very, very fast. So whenever data does not exist, that is when you're going to get this kind of message, or sometimes maybe depending on the design anyway of the site. So that is what you call as the client side. You're going to access the browser and then navigate to a web system or website and you make a request. So behind the scenes, the server is trying to create a mapping via the domain name system to ensure that it gets that domain and points it to a particular IP address like that up to the main targeted server for maybe Jumia in this context. So in this one, we are always going to make use of protocols, the rules that must be followed during this kind of communication. So those days back, we used to make use of the hypertext transfer protocol, the HTTP protocol, but it's not that secure. So due to a number of cyber attacks that are happening here and there, currently we are making use of the HTTPS protocol, the hypertext transfer protocol secure. So how do we really know that maybe a site is secure? So for example, if I open up the landing page for Jumia and I try to copy and paste. So I want you to look at the URL right here. Let me try to annotate it. So if a site is secure, it's always going to have the HTTPS protocol. It means that this site has what you call as the SSL certificates. You can read further more about that. But most of the time, secure sites are always going to have the HTTPS secure to show that the data being transmitted is always encrypted, such that if maybe we did have a hacker trying to maybe intercept the data that is being shared, maybe during a particular communication, let's try to assume that maybe you are trying to withdraw some money from your online banking system. So if this is the system and okay, if this is you and you're making use of the system, we believe that someone else can intercept. Let's assume that maybe you're trying to send money actually, trying to send money from your account to maybe someone else, like maybe your sister. So nowadays we have a number of cyber attacks, especially if your system is not secure or the system you're using. So you can have someone like a man in the middle, someone who is trying to intercept this transaction that you're currently doing. So they can always have the ability of maybe modifying the data or even stealing some data while you're trying to communicate or make actually a transaction to the other party. So to ensure that the transaction is safe, we can always work with encryption in that it converts this kind of readable data that can be shared or the message being or the data being transmitted or the payload in that it is encrypted, it is converted into a form that this kind of interceptor or the man in the middle cannot understand. So depending on the mechanism that you're really making use of. So the HTTPS is very secure in that it works with encryption to ensure that unauthorized parties cannot access the data during transit or even while at rest. And how the web server really works, I've already given you insights. The user types a website address like maybe google.com in the browser, then the DNS is always going to go ahead and make a quick resolution. So the browser is always going to contact the DNS server to find the IP address of the web server hosting the site. So on the other hand, the server is always going to do the processing in that it's going to retrieve the request, it's going to receive whatever you have requested for. And most of the times, if it is a web server, it's going to be in this kind of format. And if the resource exists, it's always going to return a response. The response is always going to be sent back to the browser that you use, so that this kind of information is displayed. So there are a number of servers out there. You can always check them out. And Apache HTTP server is the common one today. So you can always check out more insights on the types of servers. And that is going to bring us on to what we call as now a web page. So like we did see that if you have a notebook, it's going to have a number of papers or pages. I think the word is pages, the best one. So you could have page 1 and maybe we also have a different one called page 2. So every page is always going to have different content. However, in the context of web development, a web page is going to be a single document that is part of the website. And it is always going to be written into what we call as the hypertext markup language. And this is the standard language that we use for creating web pages. So these web pages can always contain text, images, videos, links, and other interactive elements. Like we did see with those examples of the websites. And I also actually gave insights on the fact that web pages are always going to be displayed in a web browser when the user visits the site. However, there are only 2 types of web pages that you must take note of. The first one is the static web page, in that the same information is always going to be displayed for all the users. So this is very common on simple company sites and portfolio sites. That, for example, if I really went to this kind of school website and I access the about, you're going to notice that whoever is going to access this site, they're always going to see this kind of information. It's not going to change most of the times. And on the other hand, we have what you call as the dynamic web pages. So for dynamic web pages, the content displayed is always going to change. And this could also be triggered by the user's interaction or maybe database updates. So this is very common on social media feeds. If maybe you're trying to access Instagram based on the web platform, you're going to notice that the posts are always going to be displayed maybe after some time or maybe after a minute, and they're going to be changing. Then on the other hand, if we do have an e-commerce product listing, like we did see with the other e-commerce stores. So right here, these are some of the types of web pages based on, for example, this news web page. Can always check it out. Then on the other hand, I had already given insights on YouTube, the fact that content is always going to be changing and you can even watch and download right here. So the type of web page depends on the requirements of the site. There are some pages that could actually be static. Then there are those that could even be dynamic. So depending on the requirements, you can always get to plan on how you're going to design a particular web page. Then for the software, I already gave you insights. We always make use of the web browser, which is a software application that we use to access and display web pages. Web browsers always connect to a web server so that they can retrieve the requested content from the client or the user, and then they go ahead and render the data or the resource when the server provides the response. Popular web browsers today, I already gave insights. We have Google Chrome, Mozilla Firefox, Safari for those that are using Apple devices, Microsoft Edge, then Opera. So you can always check all these out, but most of the times, majority of us, if maybe you're making use of the Windows operating system, you're always going to see Microsoft Edge by default, right here. And of course, now you see that I'm trying to search, and you notice that I can still see the contents of the Jumia site via Microsoft Edge. And it same applies to any other browser like I did do earlier on. Then on the other hand, if you really have Mozilla Firefox, and if maybe you don't have a particular browser, you can always go ahead and search for it and download it based on your operating system. Just that there are some that come pre-installed by default and you don't have to go through the whole reinstallation process. So this is Mozilla Firefox. Is it Mozilla or Mozilla? Okay, that one. Mozilla, depending on how you pronounce it anyway. So this is the software and you can always install it. Personally, I always work with Google Chrome, like you can see right here. So Google Chrome also do the same. Just type Chrome, and this is the logo. So the installation process is not that hard. All you're supposed to do is, for example, to know the name of the software. For example, you type Google Chrome, download, but most of the times you want to specify the operating system. For example, Google Chrome, then Windows, download. Now, among the search results, there is the first one, then we also have install Chrome and download. So, for example, you go for download Chrome. Then having accessed that page, you click on the download button and it's going to redirect you to a screen that shows that your download is in process. So most of these softwares are always going to be executable files. Whenever you see a .exe, it means that it's going to be an executable software. So once it is done, of course, you go ahead and run it and ensure that it is fully installed. So today, that is what I wanted to talk about. I hope hope the session was insightful. I'll be taking you through the structure of a web page moving forward, and also how to install or how to actually prepare our development environment. So for now, that is it, and see you right again.